This was more of the original intention. I had originally planned on having this episode, or today's sit down talk, be more of a word salad and impromptu, don't really care, don't really, just kind of existing. Time is an abstract concept which we only apply to things that we think really matter, when what we're trying to do most of the time is ignore time. Most of the time, the things that we care about are the things that we really don't need to care about, because what we do care about will ultimately be a thing that we pursue without actually needing to. And the more that we pursue something, the less likely we are to actually obtain what we're pursuing, because we are going to be it's like how you try and avoid something. If you try and avoid something, you'll head right for it. If you try and pursue something, you'll run away from it, because you'll end up trying to lead towards the antithesis rather than what it is, which has its value, has its uses. Reorienting is probably the hardest part. Reorienting yourself is an extremely necessary function that a lot of people take forever to actually get used to. If you give somebody an entire lifetime, then they won't have value for it. If you give somebody a snippet of a lifetime, then they will say that particular time frame was more important to them, because they do not necessarily have a choice in maintaining further than that particular snippet of time. So if you look at two people's interactions with one another, you can oftentimes remember more fondly somebody that you've had short conversations with than somebody that you've had in-depth in conversations with, because you start taking for granted the person that's around all the time, and the person that was there shortly ends up becoming something of a nostalgia feature. You end up thinking about the times before and after them as separate times of being. For instance, I am currently an object, or had been an object in somebody's life, and now I am no longer there. So I believe they may be internalizing me as a functional difference in their lives. And I'm wondering how they're internalizing that, but it's not my place to check or question anymore. So, that's part of life, is you sometimes drift in and out of people's lives. And not everyone's for you, unfortunately. As much as I'd like to say, everyone in this world exists for me, not everyone does. I am not that powerful. Even if I was, I wouldn't want everyone to be based on me, because I am not exactly perfect, for one, and for two, I don't think anyone should have that much power over anyone else. I don't think the person who had power over me the most recently should have had as much power over me as they had, but I allowed them to, because I was scared. And you try and give power to someone when you feel like you want to relinquish control for whatever reason. At this point in time, I had wanted to relinquish control because I was feeling like I could trust this person that I didn't know better than I could trust myself, which is such an arbitrary distinction if you think about it. Life on the whole is something to be cherished, but it's also something that is it is inevitably a tragedy, and I am more or less living a specific tragedy where I incredibly value close friendships, and so that is the thing that I lack the most currently. I think perhaps it's meant to be being a setup for a point where I would have an incredibly close friendship, so that I can more appropriately handle it, appreciate it, and maintain it. But that could just be wishful thinking. I could just be meant to be alone the rest of my life, which is an entire possibility. There is always a person who will be alone. I mean, hermitude is something that is not going to be going away. But just because you're trying to distance yourself from humanity doesn't necessarily mean you can successfully do so, for one. People will always have links to one another. There is no such thing as a person in this world that does not have human contact, and never has and never will, because that's simply impossible. Humans are born from humans, obviously. If there were a human that were born from a tree, perhaps, but even then, how would they have survived? Well, they won't. And then if you were to say have a human raised by a robot, what would it become? Would it become something between human and robot? Would it become basically a feral animal? And how do you make a human survive without physical affection? Can you teach a robot to have physical affection? Can you simulate close enough to what human interaction is that a inanimate object is able to simulate that for a human? Is there a possibility of artificial wombs being the future? And if so, could you then perhaps have a subspecies, or I guess different species of humans, say, born in space, so that we could use them as colonists, train them before they're born or while they're very young, growing up as on a space station heading towards a location to colonize a planet, perhaps. If you look towards the stars, what do you see? You see possibility. But honestly, this type of possibility is something that we should be looking closer towards ourselves for. These types of possibilities, we're always looking away from where our deepest problems lie. Our deepest problems lie within ourselves, and thereby within our planet, and thereby within our communities. Sometimes the people that we associate with and hold closest to us are the people that we don't actually know, because we've never seen them at their limits. You don't really truly know a person until you've held them over a cliff, or if you're in a situation where you've had them at absolute wit's end. There is no way of actually knowing a person until you've seen them there. You'll never know how they react. You could go an entire lifetime without truly knowing a person because of this, because we live in a world and a society where these types of things don't just fall out of the sky. We're always dreaming up an apocalypse scenario in the future, but we're not exactly expecting it to happen tomorrow, even though a lot of us are prepping for something that will never happen. Such a weird concept. But that's part of human nature. We desire the ability to survive, to fight, to grow, to be victorious. But we live in a world where such domineeringness is also put down and set as something that we shouldn't be lusting after, where power is also something that is incredibly important to us. We live in the way society is formed. There's a very specific subset of people that do almost all of the things, and then the everyman, as it were, the me, the you, the everybody else who isn't really in a position of power yet, are angry because they're not in the position, but they also wouldn't know what to do with it if they had it. They think they have the answers, but they don't. Most of the people that are there don't necessarily have the answers. They just kind of go with what the status quo is at current. They try and learn as they go. If we're lucky. If we're not lucky, then they just kind of take a massive advantage of their power, which honestly isn't really happening. If it was, it would be a lot worse than it is right now. But as things are going relatively reasonably, because nobody wants to be the next Hitler, thankfully. If they did, the world would be a vastly different place. And there's a series of checks and balances in place to make sure that that doesn't happen, thankfully, which even then, there are still atrocities in the human world, because humans are humans at the end of the day. And we'll never be able to run away from ourselves or our atrocities, and we'll never be able to be anything but what we are. But at the same time, we will always be able to be more than what we are, because we are a synthesis. We're not set in stone. We are a living species. But this living species is also quite limited, but also not limited at all. It's such a strange thing. Humanity, on the whole. We can move mountains, quite literally. And we can also condemn ourselves to the point where we are unable to physically do anything. Or we could go back from the brink of literally being able to unable to do anything, and bring ourselves back to living a normal, functional life again sometimes. There are many different perspectives to the world. There are many different lives to be lived. There are many different experiences. And each human has a unique experience and a unique perspective and a unique worldview. and each of them is useful in its own specific way. How do we make use of them? Well, that's a really good question, and I don't think that it's necessarily fair to try and say that we should make use of people who don't want to be made use of, but at the same time we are doing so anyway. Slavery still exists. There are statistics taken without people's permissions, things of that nature. We live in a, I keep going back to this, we live in a world, we live in a society, etc., but you get the point. We exist in a subdialect of genres. We exist in a mimetic system. We exist in the information age. We exist at a point in time where we probably shouldn't have ever gotten to, because our minds are going faster than our bodies. Physiologically, we are evolving slower than what the things we are creating are evolving, and that's terrifying. And that leads us to a future where we end up becoming archaic. Our bodies are, well, adapting and also not adapting. We are selectively breeding without even realizing it, and then we are wondering why specific traits are what are favored. Well, it's because what is favorable is what is bred for. People specifically look for very specific traits in specific people so that they can perpetuate the gene. That's the greedy gene, the selfish gene. Yeah, that's the one where mimetics were first introduced. It's the idea that an idea can be the same thing as a gene, and that ideas shared by humanity will always perpetuate as long as they remain relevant. And that's why mimetics, as they are things that stay alive for a very specific frame of time and then are lost forever, but never truly forgotten, as strange as that is, because they're always going to be recorded as their own individual page in history. It's weird where this series of images and words can be something that lives longer in the pages of a history book than a human, than an actual human, than the person who created it, because sometimes they're not even credited. Huh. I think I've word saladed long enough, though. I think this was cathartic.